In this video, we're going to look at the first step in the focus on form approach, doing a diagnostic for student errors, and then correcting them. If you remember from the last video, the focus on form approach is different from a traditional approach to teaching grammar, primarily because teachers don't decide to teach a grammar point and then the students learn it. It's the other way around. In the focus on form approach, students communicate, orally or in writing form. The teacher analyzes the written text or oral text, notices the mistakes the students are making, and then the teacher selects a form to focus on teaching, based on the mistakes that the students are making. That's what the PFEQ means by corrective feedback. Well, that's great, but how do we do this in an English language class of 30 or more students who are all at different levels? Don't panic just yet. We'll take a look and see just how this can be done practically. Before we start, let's think of language like a bicycle. Communication happens when the bicycle is running smoothly. I like this analogy because it helps us to see that grammar is an important part of communicating, but it's still only part of a whole. If you want, we can think of grammar as the gears in a bicycle. Maybe the vocabulary is the wheels, the bell is intonation. You get the picture. So in step one, you have to get the students to communicate. They need to produce language, either spoken or written. They need to do this as frequently as possible and in short activities, and you need to model how to do the language. The key to getting students to communicate in the target language is to create the conditions for success. A lot of students won't speak or write or are reluctant to because they're afraid of looking stupid and making mistakes. You can help them by making it a lot less intimidating. And the easiest way to do this is to ask them to write a few sentences or a short paragraph every day for a few minutes, rather than one large text. This is an example of a quick writing exercise from an activity book. It's from a unit on horoscopes. In this example, you can see that the students are only asked to write a short response, and there is scaffolding in the form of functional language. This is called sentence-wise at the top in this example, right here. Another way you can get students to practice writing quickly and in short exercises is doing free writing. I used to do this in my high school class, but I called it sprint writing. I asked the students to take out a piece of paper and just write as much as they possibly could on a given topic or question for 5 or 10 minutes. I used to do this at the start of the school year so I could see what they were capable of as a baseline. Later, I used to do it throughout the year at the start of the class to see if they already knew something about the topic before we began talking about it, or often at the end to see what they remembered. This way I could test their prior knowledge and their content, what they'd retained, but it also allowed me to check and see their grammar, spelling, and punctuation. I kept these pieces of writing to see what level their language was at, the kind of errors they were making, and to determine what I needed to focus on the next time I taught them grammar. So it's not just with writing. Your students will also find it easier to communicate orally when they do quick paired discussions, for example, rather than a long oral presentation in the front of the class. In this example, you'll see a quick exercise called turn and talk, where a student is asked to sit with a partner. This example is from the same unit on horoscopes. The students pair up and ask each other questions based on the focus vocabulary and focus form. Here it was adjectives describing personality and yes/no questions. For those of you who are interested in how to evaluate short, quick exercises for spoken and writing, this is how you do it. You can evaluate your students if you circulate, listen, and take notes as they talk. Now, you're not going to be able to evaluate all 30 students at once, but if you do 2 or 3 exercises every single class for a couple of minutes, you can take a tool like this and take notes as you walk around. By the end of the term, you should have enough notes for all of the students in the class to be able to give an overall grade without having to do an oral presentation in front of the class. Okay, now that we've got the students to produce some language, we need to use those language samples that you collected and do a diagnostic test. In other words, what is the student or students generally doing well? Where do they make mistakes most often? This is where you're like a mechanic, looking at how well the bicycle is working and where it needs some fine-tuning. Here's an example of a short text that a grade 6 student wrote. Okay, full disclosure, I asked my son, who speaks English well, but who goes to school in French, to write a short text about his free time for me. As you can see, one of my former students has identified some of his mistakes. In his case, these are mostly spelling mistakes, which makes sense because as a bilingual kid, he has an innate understanding of the most common grammatical structures in English already. You can do diagnostic tests like this one if you're working one-on-one with a student, or you can ask the whole class to write texts to get a sense of where most students are making mistakes. All right, stop the video at this point and take a look at this new example. This was a writing task done by a grade 5 student who was asked to look at the pictures and write a short story. What errors do you notice that she's made? Take out your pen, imaginary or otherwise, and correct this text as you might normally. All right, we're going to use the text you just looked at to learn about a few different correction techniques and methods. The first we'll look at is comprehensive versus selective correction. Then we'll look at how to correct directly or indirectly. All right, going back to our ice cream story again. How did you correct it? Did you correct all the mistakes that you saw? Correcting all the mistakes is called a comprehensive correction strategy. Correcting only a few targeted errors is called selective correction. Why might you want to correct all the mistakes on a paper? Why might you want to correct only a selected few? Well, let's talk first about whether or not you should correct all the mistakes in a student's work. Well, obviously you should, right? Well, no. There are many instances when you should let errors go. As a starting argument, let's take a look at this paper. All right, how does the person receiving this paper feel? So what's the problem here? Let's take a look at some of the problems that comprehensive correction can cause. First, as you just saw, it can be overwhelming for learners. Then, of course, the student's attention is really not focused on one mistake, it's focused on the 70 different mistakes that were made. Finally, it is a lot of work for the teacher, and it can be a waste of time if the student is so discouraged that they don't bother to correct anything at all. On the other hand, won't errors fossilize? That is, if you don't correct them, won't they keep on making the same mistakes and think that they're correct? Also, many learners and parents want their errors marked and corrected. I had a discussion with a friend who was frustrated because her son's English teacher only corrected the mistakes the class was working on and left some other obvious mistakes uncorrected. She felt that the English teacher was incompetent. I had to explain that the teacher was focusing on one mistake at a time, and it was probably, believe it or not, a more beneficial approach, but it was still a tough sell. For those of you that really feel uneasy about leaving errors behind, and if you want to correct more than correct less, you might want to compromise by correcting all the spelling mistakes, for example, since these errors are in a different category. They're lexical, but only correcting the grammar structure that you're focusing on. This is less discouraging for your students. Not only that, but targeting specific categories will make it a lot easier on them. It relieves the cognitive load to think about one mistake at a time. And this has been shown time and time again to be the most effective way to teach anything. If you point out 6 mistakes at once, the learner just can't understand where to focus first. And that's from everything in sports to cooking to grammar mistakes. So focus on one mistake at a time, fix that mistake, Once it's fixed, we move on to the next one. So it builds. Yeah, this selective correction also aligns with the focus on form approach. Be careful though, because it does require more attention. When we're not paying attention, we tend to correct more things rather than just focusing on the one that we've chosen. I'm going to segue here quickly and have a look at how the focus on form approach treats the evaluation of written texts. This image is a screenshot taken from the Framework for Evaluation for Elementary Students in Quebec. For Competency 3, to write text, the grammar section here is called, Application for Targeted Language Conventions. Did you notice that unlike in the French system, we don't take away points for mistake? What do you notice about the grades we give for grammar and spelling? Right here, grammar, punctuation, and spelling. That's right, we can only give grades or points for the use of grammar, spelling, and punctuation that were targeted for the task. In other words, if we weren't focusing on it specifically, we can't take off points if they misspell a word or if they are using the present perfect tense incorrectly when we're focusing just on the simple past. We also have to provide the students with lots of models and lots of scaffolding. Okay, so to summarize, we should only correct comprehensively, that is everything, when we are doing a diagnostic test. Even then, if the learners made a lot of mistakes, it might be more effective to select a few top errors to include on a short to-do list. You can also correct comprehensively when the learner's text contains so few errors that pointing out mistakes works to focus their attention. Going back to the Framework for Evaluation of Learning, comparison, here's the evaluation criteria for Competency 1 for grade cycle 2 and 3, so grade 3 to 6. Can you see where we grade grammar? This is a trick question. We don't. Because this is the communicative approach, the focus is on communicating, using vocabulary and expressions to participate in exchanges. Just so you know, all information about evaluation in the Programme de Formation de Québec can be found in these two documents. The first is the Framework for Evaluation of Learning and tells you what evaluation criteria to use, i.e. what you should use to judge your students' skills. And that's the ones we just looked at. The second is the Échelle de compétences, competency scales. These give descriptions of what your students should be doing for each competency to be on target. So if we used the Framework for Evaluation here for writing and producing text, we can use the competency scales here to see what's acceptable. Here, for example, you can see that by grade 6, in Competency 3, students should be writing short, complete sentences using simple language that's been modeled for them. They should be able to check their own writing for mistakes and be able to correct mistakes when they're pointed out. In grade 6 for Competency 1, oral interaction, the students should be able to initiate and maintain short exchanges, participate and use functional language, key expressions. Nowhere does it mention that they have to be grammatically accurate in their speech. If you're interested in having a closer look at these for elementary, but also for secondary, I've put all the documents you'll ever need by level for you in class resources. I really recommend you download these resources and take them with you even when the class is over, because if you try and find them on the ministry websites, it's notoriously difficult to do. It's very hard to find the documents and the links are often broken. So once you have the documents in one place, it's a great idea to download them and keep them for reference. Okay, we looked at whether or not to correct selectively or comprehensively. Now let's look at when and how and why to correct directly or indirectly. All right, going back to Ariel and the ice cream. How did you correct it? Did you correct the mistakes by crossing it out and writing the correct form? If you did, this is called direct correction. Perhaps you simply circled or highlighted the mistakes you found. Well, this is called indirect correction. Can you see the difference? Why might you use one strategy over another? Going back to the free time text that my student corrected, what kind of correction did they do? Direct or indirect? Is the correction strategy consistent? Well, as you can see, probably not really. Here, they've corrected directly. This one, indirectly. Directly, directly, indirectly. Indirectly, indirectly, indirectly. You can see what they're doing. What do you think was the strategy behind the teacher's choices? Let's have a look. Going back again, here's a quick test. If you're looking at this example, is it direct or indirect? What's the mistake? What should the correct form be? Do you know? What about this second example? What kind of correction is this? If you guess indirect for the first one, you are right. Indirect correction simply draws the learner's attention to the mistake, while direct correction not only corrects and gives the right form, it often gives you the reason why. So, which is the most effective strategy to use in a language classroom? Should we correct directly or indirectly? Well, like most things in life, the answer isn't straightforward. There are advantages and disadvantages to each. Direct correction may help learners who are not proficient enough to self-correct. In other words, most of your students, if they're making the mistake, probably don't realize it's a mistake in the first place. They also may not know what the correct form is. It's also faster for you to just write the correct form for them. Direct correction is really effective with errors that respond to rules. We know that a lot of forms in English have exceptions, and it provides a model of what's acceptable in L2. The biggest argument against direct correction is that it doesn't allow the learners to think about the language, to really get them to question, why is this a mistake? Indirect correction does bring the learner to think about the language, or at least it can. If the error is simply circled, it makes them pause and say, what's the problem here? However, it may lead to frustration. If they're pausing and wondering what the problem is, if they don't have enough information, they can be frustrated. Well, what does the teacher want me to do? So this might be a strategy that's best for more advanced learners who have metacognition and resources in place to help them figure it out. The other problem with indirect correction is that it requires more time and reflection on the part of the teacher because you may just not know what the mistake actually is. You may not have understood what the learner was trying to say. We'll have a look at this in a second. So when do we use each kind? We use direct correction for beginners. We use direct correction when focusing on a new form and you're teaching it. Use direct correction when you are getting kids or students to correct each other's work to avoid confusion. Also, when you're not sure what the student is trying to say but want to take a guess, and this happens a lot when you're giving feedback. You can write things like, do you mean you're talking about your friend? Is your friend a boy or a girl? Because you're using the female pronoun, for example, when you referred to your friend previously as a boy, and this causes confusion. Again, when you give an example of what to say. So indirect correction are great for more advanced learners, and when highlighting a mistake in a previously seen form. One of the greatest strategies to do if you want to blend direct and indirect is to give a direct correction the first time you see a mistake, and then for all subsequent errors, simply circle it. So for example, going back to it's with an apostrophe or it's without an apostrophe, if you correct it directly the first time and explain the rule, if you see other examples of the same mistake, you can simply highlight it and the student will probably know what to do. The rule of thumb is, when in doubt, you should correct directly to avoid confusion and mistakes. Okay, take a closer look at the bottom of the page from the free time text. Can you see the correction code here? Why do teachers use correction codes? Well, correction codes are kind of a cheat. They function as a sort of hybrid between direct and indirect correction. They allow the teacher to correct indirectly, but give guidance for the student about the kind of mistake they're making. Teachers like correction code because it cuts down on the explanations we have to give the student. How many of you use codes when correcting? Here's another example of a coding chart. What kind of information does it give students? How do students respond to correction codes? So here's the thing with correction codes. They can be really useful, but they can also be really confusing. So for example, have a look at this mistake. It's hard for me for remember. What kind of error is this? Is it a problem with the preposition? With the verb? Is it lexical? If we don't know what the student is trying to say, we may not be able to correct the mistake accurately. Trying to use meta-language to explain it to the student is also really difficult. So what should we do then? Well, in this case, the rule of thumb is correct directly. Give the student the correct form. And then you can sit down and ask them if you have a chance to conference and figure out why they made the mistake that they're making. Okay, Danielle Gannett did her doctorate on error corrections and feedback and what's the most useful for English second language learners, especially in Quebec. And she summarized it in several survival tips. So here's the first survival tip. Don't adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. If you're not sure what a student means, just leave it alone or ask a question. Be selective about what you correct, adapt it to your students, and personalize it. Design writing tasks that focus on the structure you want to practice. We'll get into this more when we talk about the writing process. So once the students have learned the difference between it's and its, you're going to want to give them an opportunity to prove that they know how to use it. So you're going to find a way to ask them to write about something that will force them to use it's and its, for example. Don't correct everything that the learners write. Let things go. That's kind of like number 2. Do conferences. It's actually a lot quicker, believe it or not, to sit down one-on-one with a student and check to see what they mean and to be able to explain it to them one-on-one than it might be to write feedback in the margins. Have students write shorter texts more often. As we talked about earlier, not only is this less intimidating, but it's actually a lot more effective when you're learning anything to do short, frequent sessions than one long session. Training learners to self-edit. So get them to have a checklist. My kids do this in French all the time, where they have to check the punctuation, the verb accords, and the spelling. They have a checklist of things to go through. You can use these same checklists to have them sit with a partner and check each other's work. If you're using codes, make sure that the students really know what the codes mean and keep them simple. Some of the simplest ones that you can use are just spelling, punctuation, and capitals. Collective correction activities are ones where you take a selection of text and you do it together with the whole class, and this is a really great way to model what they should do. Finally, involve the students in revision activities and make sure that they're actually doing something with the corrections. And I really want to focus on this one because, and this is the kicker, you should not be correcting and errors that students are making unless the students have a chance to do something with them. If you're going to spend the time, effort, and energy to correct students' writing, and you give it back to them without asking them to do a new draft, what are they going to do? They'll simply put it in the recycling bin, either metaphorically or actually. So if you're going to do corrections, make sure it's on a draft version, not on the final draft. That way the student can take the paper back and bring you a polished version. Okay, it's been it's been a long session so far, but we're almost at the end. Which errors do we focus on? Which errors do we prioritize? With all of these mistakes on a page, which ones do we look at first if we're not going to correct all of them? So it's hard to determine where to start. Based on Gannett's research, I came up with a checklist I think you might find it useful to have on hand when correcting. So here are the mistakes you should focus on. The first one are errors that lead to a communication breakdown. So if the word, phrase, or sentence can't be understood by the person reading it, then we're not achieving the basic goal of learning a language, which is to communicate. These errors must be addressed first. Next are errors that are stigmatized. If you haven't encountered this already, you will. Because people in popular culture, TV, films, social media, YouTube, often use vernacular language and do things like drop the F-bomb frequently, our students often believe it's okay to use these words as well. You'll need to explain to students why words like the F word or the SH word just can't be used in the classroom or on written assignments. If you don't, they'll think it's okay to use them in front of their boss, their new friends, anyone that's in a formal situation, and that's not great. Next are errors that have been the focus of instruction. If you've been focusing on learning a structure, your students should be expected to check to see that they use that structure correctly, and you should point it out again when they don't. You should look at errors that have been selected by the teacher or learner himself. We'll talk about this more, especially when we look at the writing process and portfolios, but you'll want to bring the student to self-select their mistakes eventually. So an example of this might be in my class of Secondary 1 students, grade 7. If the whole class is working on writing a scene for a short story, for example, one of my students might have set themselves the goal of using capital letters correctly. Another might be working on the correct punctuation for a dialogue because it's different in French and English. And a third, who's pretty high level and rarely makes any mistakes, might be working on adding more descriptive language to the scene by using adjectives and adverbs. Finally, the last one to look at is errors that occur frequently in a learner's output. When you've covered all of the above mistakes, a really simple rule of thumb is to look at what mistakes the student is making most often. If you address mistakes by categories, for example, plural nouns, it's easier for the student to correct several errors at once, and you'll be more efficient. We'll see this in the next slide. Have a look at this text. Do you notice the errors that lead to a communication breakdown? That's right. In this text, the student says, my 3 favorite flavor, ice cream, are Bar a Papa, Smarties, and Bubblegum. Now, the biggest error here is that no English speaker would really understand Bar a Papa unless they also spoke French. So this is the one we really need to correct first. What about errors that are stigmatized? Do you see any of these? None here. What about errors that have been the focus of instruction? I don't know. Maybe we can assume present tense verbs, especially sentence structures describing likes and dislikes. I like, I don't like. Not sure. What about errors that have been selected by the teacher or learner himself? Well, this we don't know yet. Finally, errors that occur frequently in the learner's output. As I'm going through here, I think one of the mistakes I see that they're making most often is plurals. Sundays are very good with chocolate, chips, my 3 favorite flavors. I don't like strawberry ice cream. I like my ice cream cone with chocolates or chocolate and little candies. See how it might be difficult to know whether or not to correct? So finally, as this student's teacher then, I would probably address the following mistakes. Number 1 would be barapapa, which is a communication breakdown. And number 2 would be plural nouns, because they're frequently found in the student's output. Sorry, try again. This time with Ariel's ice cream story. What errors would you address? Take time to check using the checklists. If you want, you can discuss with your peers or email me to ask for help. So, thanks for listening to this video. As you can see, we started by how to correct a paper, and this video we're focusing on correcting the errors using direct or indirect, or selective or comprehensive. The next video will have a look at how to give feedback to really help the students improve throughout the paper and at the end. Thanks for watching.